People become strong when they stop trying to be loved by those who don't know how to love. Carl Jung. Have you ever loved someone like that? Someone who made you feel like you were the problem. You were too much, too emotional, too needy. They were different. They were calm, rational, emotionally controlled. They pulled away and you, the deep feeler, spiraled into confusion. Every time they distanced themselves, you reached in closer. Every time they went quiet, you tried harder to understand. What you didn't know was you were being pulled into an emotional power game you never agreed to play. And then, one day, you stopped. You no longer begged. You no longer over-explained your feelings. You just stood still, clear, gentle, and you saw them more clearly than ever before. Not because you attacked, but because you refused to collapse. And that is the moment the avoidance ego begins to crack. No drama, no shouting. Just your deep clarity and self-respect, and suddenly, the wall they've spent their whole life building begins to fall. A super empath is not a fragile, overly emotional person, nor are they someone who drowns in other people's feelings and loses themselves. They are deeply intuitive, able to feel what's left unsaid, read the emotions in someone's eyes, and sense when an emotional game is being played. But unlike regular empaths, super empaths don't get consumed by what they feel, because they've learned the most vital skill for survival without self-betrayal: emotional boundaries. A super empath can see the avoidance wounds, even the ones the avoidant themselves can't name. They understand that behind the coldness is anxiety. Behind the silence is fear of exposure. Behind the hyper-independence is the terror of being hurt. But instead of trying to fix the avoidant, the super empath remains present with an open, non-judgmental heart while refusing to be pulled into dysfunction. And that's exactly what makes them dangerous to the avoidance ego. Because avoidants often thrive on controlling emotional dynamics. They're used to others panicking when they withdraw. They're used to being chased, appeased, and emotionally pursued. But the super empath doesn't do that. They still love, but they don't beg. They remain open, but they don't accept emotional irresponsibility. They stay, but they don't compromise with avoidance. It's this clarity, both gentle and firm, that makes the super empath the most powerful mirror the avoidant has ever faced. A mirror in which they can no longer hide from themselves. Sign 1. Calm self. Respect. When not reacting is the most powerful response. The strength of a super empath doesn't come from being a great debater or having intense emotions. It lies in this simple truth: they don't have to do anything, and that alone is enough to shake the avoidant's sense of control. Avoidantly attached people are used to this cycle. When they pull away, others panic. When they go silent, others overfunction. When they act distant, people lean in harder, trying to earn their warmth back. And to the avoidant, those reactions are proof of emotional power rooted in withdrawal. But a super empath doesn't play that game. When the avoidant retreats, tests boundaries, or disappears emotionally, the super empath doesn't chase. They don't flood them with messages. They don't explain themselves over and over. They don't beg for closeness. They simply observe and step back, not out of anger, not from fear, but because they know this: real love cannot survive in a space poisoned by emotional manipulation. And for the avoidant, this is a quiet inner earthquake. They've built their identity around being emotionally untouchable. They've counted on the other person bending, shrinking, and sacrificing just to keep the connection alive. But when the super empath quietly withdraws, while still holding deep self-respect, a crack appears in the avoidance ego. Because for the first time, they no longer control the emotional distance. They can't draw the other person into the same old push-pull routine. They've lost the upper hand and they feel it. The super empath isn't trying to teach them a lesson. They're just refusing to participate in a game they never signed up for. And that refusal, that calm, rooted no, lands louder than any emotional outburst. Not to hurt, but to protect what matters most: their own dignity. What does the avoidant feel in that moment? Outwardly, they may seem fine, but inside, the questions start spinning. Why aren't they reacting like everyone else? Why doesn't she need me to validate her? Am I not the emotional center anymore? The stillness of the super empath isn't coldness. It's clarity, the invisible boundary between love and emotional self-abandonment. It's how they say, "I still care about you, but I won't destroy myself to stay connected to you. And that is the first fracture in the avoidance well-defended ego. Avoidants aren't afraid of being disliked. They're afraid of being fully seen, with no place left to hide. They're not afraid of losing someone, they're afraid of losing control. And when the super empath doesn't chase, doesn't collapse, doesn't play along, that entire system of control starts to crumble. No lectures, no drama, just someone who still loves but refuses to bow. That's how a super empath begins to dismantle the avoidance emotional armor, not with force, but with grounded self-respect. Sign 2. Emotionally X-ray truths. When gentle words disarm the avoidant ego, there's one thing avoidantly attached people think they hide well: their true emotions. They bury them under logic, becoming overly analytical. They mask them with humor, turning vulnerability into jokes. They hide behind silence, retreating the moment things get too close. But a super empath doesn't get fooled. With their innate emotional intuition, they can feel what isn't being said, notice micro-expressions others miss, and sense exactly when someone is afraid, even when that person is acting indifferent. And sometimes, they drop a single sentence, soft in tone, yet piercing through every emotional wall like an X-ray beam. You're not distant because you don't care. You're distant because you're afraid. That statement doesn't come with anger. It's not meant to shame or accuse, but to the avoidance ego, it's a direct hit to the core. Because what the ego fears most isn't rejection. It's being seen too clearly, too soon. The super empath isn't trying to win the interaction. They speak the truth, but with deep compassion. And that's exactly what destabilizes the avoidance ego the most. If you saw their fear and used it against them, they'd know how to fight back. But if you saw their fear and didn't attack or abandon them, their emotional defense system doesn't know what to do. Their mind may deny it. Their words might deflect it. But inside, the ego trembles with one terrifying realization. How did they see this part of me? How do they know what I've always hidden? How can they see me so clearly and still stay? That's when the avoidant comes face to face with what they've always run from. I'm not emotionally detached. I'm scared. And the super empath isn't trying to teach them a lesson. They just want connection, but not one built on illusions, avoidance, or emotional manipulation. They want something real, and they show up fully, not to rescue, but to invite. And surprisingly, this level of emotional transparency doesn't make the avoidant feel judged. It makes them feel something they rarely allow themselves to feel: safe. For the first time, a part of them whispers, maybe I can be seen and still be loved. Maybe I can be afraid and not be abandoned. But this is also the moment when the ego fights back the hardest. It panics. It wants to pull away, sabotage, or shut down. That's why many avoidants become even colder after moments of emotional intimacy, because their ego is terrified. It doesn't know how to handle this kind of love. The kind that sees you and still stays. The kind that doesn't demand perfection. The kind that reflects your truth without destroying you. To the super empath, seeing through someone isn't a power move. It's an invitation. I see you. I'm not walking away. But I also won't stay if you keep hiding. This isn't pity. This is a form of clarity that refuses to be exploited. And to the avoidant, being seen this clearly and not being pushed away is something the ego doesn't know how to handle. It creates a strange sense of instability. This person could destroy me with what they know. But the super empath doesn't destroy. They just stand as a quiet, patient mirror. And no one can keep avoiding the gaze of a mirror like that forever. Sign 3. Refusing to play the emotional game when not being manipulated becomes the loudest response. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, withdrawal is rarely accidental. It's a strategy, a way to maintain control. They create emotional ambiguity. They don't confirm, but don't deny. They don't speak up, but punish when unspoken expectations are unmet. They won't end the connection, but keep the other person constantly wondering. This gray zone is where the avoidant feels safest and most powerful. They hold the emotional upper hand by keeping others in a constant state of second-guessing. For most empaths, this becomes a dangerous loop. The more they try to fix it, the more the avoidant withdraws. The more they explain, the more they're labeled as too much. But a super empath doesn't play that game. They recognize the pattern and they opt out. When the avoidant starts pulling away, the super empath doesn't spiral. When their messages are ignored, they don't send 3 more. When faced with silent treatment or emotional withholding, they don't decode every punctuation mark or overanalyze every delay. They observe, they assess, and then they pull their energy back calmly and clearly. No anger, no drama, just a quiet refusal to engage in emotional manipulation. And that alone shakes the avoidant's ego to its core, because their entire sense of emotional dominance was built on one assumption: the other person needs me more than I need them. But when the super empath stops first, when they don't plead, don't protest, don't hold on any longer, that system of control collapses instantly. Suddenly, it's the avoidant who starts wondering, why aren't they fighting for me anymore? Why isn't this working like it used to? Do they not need me anymore? Did I just lose something I never truly valued until now? The super empath isn't trying to make the avoidant feel bad. They're simply no longer willing to betray themselves to maintain a one-sided connection. They don't retaliate, but they also don't wait around in confusion. And that, right there, is the most powerful psychological shift. Their silence isn't surrender, it's clarity. Their calm withdrawal isn't emotional collapse, it's choice. They still care, but they no longer tolerate being emotionally toyed with as the price of connection. And when a super empath quietly reclaims their energy, the avoidant feels the absence clearly. No one waiting on the other end of unread messages. No one offering explanations for what was never acknowledged. No one keeping the emotional flame alive while they pour water on it. The ego starts to lose its grip. Suddenly, the avoidant is the one being left behind, not because they weren't good enough, but because they're no longer the only one controlling the pace of the relationship. The super empath doesn't walk away to teach a lesson. They walk away to choose themselves, and that alone is enough to shake the avoidant's entire defense system. Sign 4. Healing energy that triggers shame. When the avoidant ego is exposed by kindness, there's a kind of energy that doesn't raise its voice, doesn't lecture, and doesn't pressure. But the moment it shows up, everything that's been hidden begins to surface. That is the energy of a super empath, gentle, accepting, and radiant like a mirror. To someone with an avoidant attachment style, this energy feels both safe and dangerous. Safe because it doesn't demand anything. Dangerous because it forces them to feel themselves. They've grown used to hiding their soft part, to protecting themselves with isolation, to convincing themselves, I don't need anyone. But when faced with someone who loves without control, sees without judgment, and stays patient without abandoning themselves, their emotional armor begins to crack. Not because someone pointed out their flaws, but because they start seeing themselves more clearly than ever before. And what rises to the surface first isn't love. It's shame. Shame for not being able to stay close to what they truly want. Shame for pushing love away out of fear. Shame for running again from the very connection they crave. The super empath doesn't try to fix the avoidant. They don't force them to open up. But their grounded, unshakable presence becomes a mirror that's too honest to ignore. When the avoidant looks into that mirror, they don't just see the empath, they see themselves, the wounds they never dealt with, the beliefs about being unworthy, the patterns of withdrawal that quietly ruin what they long for. The ego used to blame, deflect, and disguise suddenly has nowhere to hide, because the person in front of them isn't fighting, isn't controlling, isn't chasing. They're just standing there clear, warm, and not willing to lose themselves to stay connected. That's why avoidants, in these moments, often respond in 2 extreme ways. They melt sensing rare safety and starting to open. They sabotage because closeness this deep scares their ego into panic. They might pull away, make excuses, go cold, not because they don't feel love, but because that love is shining light on the part of them they've buried the deepest. The feeling of being unlovable. The super empath may not even realize that just by being present, softly and clearly, they are unraveling the avoidance defenses. Not because they're overpowering, but because they don't play emotional games. They don't need the avoidance ego to dissolve in order to be whole. They simply stand as an example of love that doesn't cling but also doesn't collapse. And that makes the avoidant begin to wonder, if this person sees all of me and still doesn't leave, then what exactly am I running from? Shame, in this context, is not the enemy. It's a signal that the emotional armor is cracking. And if they can look through it, rather than flee from it, they may just find the doorway to something deeper. Healing. Sign 5. When the super empath leaves in peace and takes the illusion of control with them, the super empath doesn't leave to punish. They don't storm out to make a point. They don't create chaos or drama to leave someone reeling with regret. They leave, quietly, peacefully. And that, more than any loud exit or painful goodbye, is what shatters the avoidance ego the fastest. They don't leave to teach a lesson. They leave because they finally remember their worth. They've given too much, waited too long, hoped for change too many times. And then, at some quiet moment, they whisper to themselves, "I don't have to hurt anymore. No accusations, no ultimatums. No, you need to change speeches. Just a deeply grounded decision, to choose themselves." Avoidants are used to being the ones who are chased. They're used to others trying to get through to them, trying to pull them back in, trying to scale walls that were never meant to be climbed. But this time, it's different. This time, the one who leaves is the one who saw them the clearest, not because they stopped loving, but because they couldn't keep loving through coldness, vagueness, and emotional disappearance. And what wounds the avoidant ego most isn't abandonment. It's the realization that they were fully seen and still not enough to be stayed for. Because the person walking away wasn't just anyone. They were the one who had accepted them in their rawest, most unguarded form. The one who had seen through the defenses, the silence, the sarcasm, and still chose love. And now, that very same person, the one who once held their souls so gently, is walking away without looking back. In that silence, the avoidant ego collapses. There's no more control, no more emotional dominance, no one left to pull the strings. The super empath leaves no mess, but they leave a vacuum, a quiet space that the avoidant is finally forced to sit with. They saw me that clearly, and they still walked away. And that truth, it echoes louder than any goodbye ever could. A super empath doesn't destroy an avoidance ego through rage. They don't scream, they don't manipulate, they don't try to force a breakthrough. They break the ego with truth, with self-respect, and with a kind of unconditional clarity that doesn't demand, but doesn't collapse either. They don't yell, they don't chase, they simply stand tall in who they are, and refuse to be pulled into emotional power game. And that alone makes the avoidant ego start to crumble, or awaken, because what the ego fears most is to be seen so clearly, so gently, and so undeniably. If you're the avoidant, this isn't your cue to defend. It's your opportunity to awaken. Look again. They didn't try to fix you. They didn't try to possess you. They simply stood there as a mirror for you to meet yourself. And remember this, people like the super empath don't come around twice. And when they leave, they take with them the one thing your ego could never hold on to. A love that is both deep and free, not to trap you, but to invite you to grow,